And joining us now on the debate in Washington, D.C., Matthias Matisse. He is professor in the School of International Service at American University. Colin Bradford, senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation in Waterloo, Ontario, and senior fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington. And we welcome back Yanis Varoufakis, professor of economics at the University of Athens. Let's just start. Colin, maybe I'll get you to start on this. You heard the modest proposal from our guest here in the studio, Yanis. I don't see much uptake in the Eurozone at the moment for his modest proposal. How do you like it?
Oh, I think it's on the right track. I think the thing that Professor Jan Varoufakis, I would like to interchange with you on this is I don't see how you square that proposal, which seems very reasonable and in fact is embedded in the G20 communique and is the work plan of the finance ministers of Europe meeting in Brussels, I think, today and yesterday, and the G20 finance ministers as they continue to talk to each other. That is basically the plan. Your third proposal about recycling the German surplus into growth areas in Europe is a new wrinkle to that, an interesting one, but I think the first two proposals of having a euro fund, essentially, to a euro bailout fund through the EFSF is exactly what the Europeans have been trying to do, and having the Europeans, core Europeans, understand that the ECB needs to be a lender of last resort is exactly what's on the table. So I think that much is fine. The other issues about how you see Greece, I'm not sure how that fits into it, because in fact both Greece and Italy need to act themselves in a disciplined and fiscally consolidating way for the whole system to work its way out. And the funds are not going to be put on the table by the core Europeans unless the deficit Europeans actually take action themselves.
Okay, let me get Matthias in for some more feedback from him. Matthias, how do you see this modest proposal?
Yeah, I like the plan very much, but given the current political situations in Germany, I don't see that much desire for taking their own surpluses and investing them in the peripheral areas where growth is very much needed and investment is needed, even though I like the idea. But as Colin said too, I mean, I think it's absolutely right. The European Central Bank is the only institution that's capable of acting, especially in the absence of a common fiscal authority and so much disagreement amongst the 17 Eurozone members. But I think Colin is right. I mean, I think the markets need to see some kind of technocratic government in both Italy and Greece that can reassure them that they can push through reforms.
You want to come back on those comments?
Yes, a couple of important points. First, Colin, you're absolutely right. If Europe gets its act together, this does not mean that Greece will be saved. But for Greece to be saved, there is a necessary condition that Europe gets its act together. It's not a sufficient condition. And Greece has to do all the things that are necessary in order to put Greece back on a sustainable path. But let me say that austerity is not what Greece needs. We have reached a situation now where there is absolutely no liquidity in the private sector in Greece at the moment. And every new measure of austerity reduces that liquidity further and expands the deficit. This deficit, as you know, cannot be cut if, while reducing government expenditure, the tax take is crumbling. Regarding the surplus recycling mechanism, we don't need to reinvent the wheel here. We have an institution, a splendid institution in Europe called the European Investment Bank. And I tell you, they have astonishingly interesting and promising business plans for massive investments, which are not going even to tap into, through the public sector, the surpluses of Germany. The EIB issues its own bonds and has been doing this now for more than 10 years. The only thing that stops the EIB from being that surplus recycling mechanism is a clause in its charter which says that 50% of every investment program has to be financed by the nation state. Of course, the nation states are bankrupt, so it doesn't happen. But if we have the ECB managing the debt through issuing its own bonds, then there is nothing to stop the ECB collaborating with the EIB and issuing and putting forward a net issue of bonds which, in collaboration with the EIB, will fund those projects. And that would be like something, a new deal for Europe. So I don't want to take more.
No, that's good. Colin, you want to react to that?
Yeah, no, I'm very much on the same page with you about that, Yanis, in terms of the European actions. But I think the thing I'd like to hear you comment on is what you said earlier on was pretty discouraging about the Greek people's willingness and capacity to deal with this. You said this really wasn't a Greek crisis, it's a European crisis. You said that the Greek government wasn't sovereign anymore, and you said basically that the Greek people would not be have the will to overcome the arithmetic of what faces them. I think you just can't. I mean, I think one of the reasons why the last few days in Cannes were so indeterminate was that you can't have the Europeans pledging resources and inventing mechanisms, as you just explained very well, and which is very promising, I think, without commensurate commitment on the part of the European deficit governments, namely Italy and Greece right now, to a long-term, medium-term fiscal consolidation plan and growth plan, which reduces their debt as a result of, as a percentage of GDP. As this crisis moves on day by day, we're seeing, as you know, the interest rate on on Greek debt go up. It went up from yesterday 6.68% to 6.74% this morning. That's approaching the tipping point of 7%. If it's going to be so much greater than possible GDP growth in Greece, that debt will continue to become an increasingly large portion of the Greek economy unless there's a plan and a commitment, financial commitment behind it from the Europeans. In other words, two parts to the story. The Greeks commit and the Europeans also back it up with financial support that puts it on in a sustainable recovery and consolidation path.
Matthias,
without that, I mean, there's no deal, and Greece might as well pull out of the European Union.
Let me get Matthias to comment on this.
Eurozone, sorry.
Understood, the Eurozone. There are a lot of smart people working on this problem. And I want to read something that Mark Harrison wrote in seekingalpha.com just a few days ago that speaks to that. And then, Matthias, I'll get you to comment on this first. In the opening session of the 4th Annual CFA Institute European Investment Conference, November 2nd in Paris, MIT Sloan School of Management professor Simon Johnson didn't equivocate on the perils of the current global economic environment. Professor Johnson cited alarming parallels with October 1931, when, quote, people thought the worst was behind them, but the smart people were wrong, and instead the crisis just broadened. Now, Matthias, using that parallel, are the smart people equally wrong today, and therefore the global economy is even in more trouble than we think? What's your view on that?
I'm afraid I'm going to have to be pessimistic here and agree with Professor Johnson from MIT. And I think Yanis has mentioned it, the kind of obsession with austerity. We had the same thing in 1931-32. Let's not forget FDR ran on balanced budgets in 1932 election against Herbert Hoover. And I think this is the problem here. We all agree that Greece needs austerity, and Italy needs it, and Spain needs it. And that's true. I think the Greek people could take 2 years of austerity. They've already taken 2 years of austerity. Can they take 10 years of austerity? I don't think any democratic electorate can take 10 years of austerity. I think the issue is, which is well known, is the imbalances within the Eurozone. Would it help if Germany would be to reflate their economy a bit? For sure it would. Would it help if the Chinese would help? All of these things I think are important. But the fundamental issue is this, that Germany wants Mediterranean countries to become like Germany. And that's impossible, because the only reason why Germany has been Germany over the last 10 years, been very successful, is because the others weren't, right? I mean, whatever Germany was exporting, those countries were importing. Whatever Germany was lending, those countries were borrowing. So both are the different sides of one coin. So in that sense, I think the Northern European countries have to give something too in this global rebalancing act. And in that sense, it's very similar, the discussion we have within the G20 between China and the United States.
Colin, having said all that, I want you to help our viewers, most of whom are here in the province of Ontario. I want you to explain to them how this is possible. And let's do a little comparison here. Greece is a population of about 11 million. The province of Ontario, where this program emanates from, is about 13 million, so very similar. Greece's GDP is 320 billion roughly. Ontario's, one province in Canada, is twice that. So how is it that a country that is even smaller than one province inside Canada is able to pull down virtually the whole Eurozone with what's going on right now? Explain that to people if you would.
Well, I think the difference is that the Canadian banking system is less leveraged than the Greek and European banking systems. And as a consequence, I mean, the big tragedy of Greece is that it is a small tail wagging this large dog, or dogs, the Eurozone in the first instance and the global economy in the second. Why is that? It's not because of the size of the Greek economy, but because the European banks and global banks hold Greek debt. And it's a significant enough part of their balance sheets so that it affects European banks and other international banks. So I think that's the fundamental problem. And if it was just Greece alone, it would be one thing. But it's quite clear, and it's been clear for some time, not just this morning, that Italy is in just as much trouble in terms of political instability and financial vulnerability as Greece is. So, and that is a very significantly larger economy with still more debt, both as a percentage of its GDP and as a grand total, absolute total, than Greece. So it's a combination of the leveraged aspects of Europe and global banks vis-a-vis Greece, and the degree to which the Greek government is unable to deal with these problems.
And I guess, can I say this, Yannis? I guess more people in Ontario are prepared to pay their taxes than people in Greece. Is that accurate too?
That's because they have to.
Because they have
to. The problem with Greece is not so much tax evasion, it's tax immunity. But that's a big question. Matthias, I'm not going to comment on anything you said simply because I agree with every word you said. So there's no sense in wasting time on it. Colin, 2 points. Firstly, you're absolutely right. As I said before, Europe's actions, as long as they are along a rational path, are necessary but not sufficient for Greece to get out of the mire in which it finds itself. But let's look at Europe's actions. Since May 2010, like Macbeth, Europe has been piling up one crime on top of another. Look at the agreement of the 21st of July, which was supposed to be the final solution for the Greek tragedy. We were given a haircut of around 20% to our existing debt. We were given a massive reduction in the interest rates of the loans that we had taken from the European Union and the IMF. Massive reduction, there's no doubt about that. And in exchange for that, we were asked to take another large pay cut. My salary has been reduced by 30% at the University of Athens, just to give you an indication. That's part of the pain that we have to suffer. Okay? And this was hailed at the time, in the middle of the summer, as the end of our trials and tribulations. 2 days later, Italy and Spain fell, as some of us had predicted it would, because the rest of the package was shoddy. It was placing the burden on what I call the toxic EFSF, the toxic bailout. And if you look at the EFSF, the way it is being structured, it's like a CDO. It's just a giant CDO. And it is bound never to solve the problem. And the tragedy with the EFSF is that either it doesn't have enough money to do the job, or if you give it enough money to do the job, then because it's toxic, the high toxicity is multiplied, and it starts spreading the infection, the toxicity through the Euro system. So Europe has not pulled itself together. If Europe, in July, in October, Colin, had given Greeks a sense that Europe now has a rational plan for dealing with Ireland, with Portugal, with the French banks, with Deutsche Bank. And as part of this, they're asking us to pull ourselves together. Then I tell you, the vast majority of the Greeks would be prepared to do what it takes in order to be part of the solution. But they have not done that. Yeah. If you look at the October the 26th agreement, it will go down in the annals of economic history as one of the greatest, the longest suicide notes of any currency union. Now, regarding the question you put, you're absolutely right. You cannot blame a snowflake for the avalanche. If it wasn't Greece, it would have been somebody else. Had Greece never gone into the Eurozone, do you think that the Eurozone now would not be in trouble? The tragedy from a political perspective, the perspective of what I call the democratic deficit of Europe, is that the real realm in which this crisis is unfolding and evolving is the banking system, particularly the French banks, the German banks, as well as France and Spain. This is where it all will be decided. But it is much easier for German and French politicians to discuss the Greek debt than it is for Mr. President Sarkozy, for instance, to discuss BNP Paribas.
Well, let me pick up on that, because we have a very fine columnist for the Globe and Mail who is in Europe and writes about these things. His name is Doug Saunders. And apropos of some of the comments that our Prime Minister made after the recent G20 meeting in France, he wrote this. He said, "You might call it the Ottawa Doctrine. Canada's top officials took to the streets of Europe this weekend with a sharply worded new message for the continent. In essence, you've got enough money to sort out your own problems, leave the rest of us alone. These are wealthy countries who've got to have and do have the means to deal with their own problems," Prime Minister Stephen Harper of Canada said, noting that the United States managed its own large-scale bailout 3 years ago without resorting to external funds. Matthias, let me get you to comment on that first. Do you agree with Prime Minister Harper that, in fact, this is Europe's problem and Europe should take care of it itself?
No, I completely agree. I mean, the United States has $10 trillion in consumption, so does the European Union. China has $2 trillion of world's consumption annually. So I don't see how even the Chinese could solve this problem, even though it would certainly help. I mean, I think it's come so far that the markets want a kind of sign that the rest of the world is not going to allow Europe to mess this up. I mean, we've been there for 2 years now. So maybe a sign from Washington that the Federal Reserve here wants to coordinate more closely its actions with the ECB, investment from the Chinese, the Indians, the Brazilians. I mean, this is not going to solve the problem on its own, but it might certainly help. Right? I mean, it's like solving the US deficit. We all know it's not going to happen by taxing the top 1%, but it would certainly help. But at the same time, I think there is still the lack of a realization, especially on the part of Germany, that they need to commit a lot more funds. But obviously, the more funds they commit, and they're stretched right now, this would affect their own sovereign debt rating too. Germany would lose its AAA rating, France would lose its AAA rating, and I don't think they're willing to go that far. But they certainly have the resources to do so. I mean, I don't think it's only Stephen Harper that has said this. These are very rich countries. But I think the problem is a deeper one. We see the kind of problems in the G20 being indecisive. And we see the problems in Europe being indecisive because there's no clear leader in the G20 anymore, as the US used to play in the G8. And I think right now the Germans are still kind of not comfortable with their powerful position, right? I mean, the parity between France and Germany is long gone. Germany calls the shots. Every European Union summit, we look towards Angela Merkel. There's only one person the media focus on. It's astonishing. This didn't used to be the case for a very long time. And I think Germany is still not at ease with this newfound power, economic power and political power. And I think they basically need to play a much larger role, but they can't, we all know, for domestic political reasons, for the German Constitutional Court's reasons. But I think that's the fundamental problem of kind of indecisiveness within Europe, is that Germany, the power that could do it, is still unwilling to play that role for whatever obviously historical reasons.
Colin Bradford, what's your view on that, whether Germany ought to be and can play a larger role in finding a way out of all of this?
Well, I think that what's going on is there could be a maximalist way out of this, which would be a multilateral solution whereby nobody's looking to any single leader, neither Angela Merkel in Germany nor Barack Obama in the United States nor Hu Jintao in China to solve the problem, but together. That's why the G20 is a good grouping, because that is widely representative of the major countries and the major regions. A multilateral solution would be, could happen in which you have simultaneous actions at all levels. The nations, first of all, the vulnerable nations, take fiscal consolidation plans by the teeth, approved by big majorities in their parliaments to set the stage for financial backing from the rest of the world. The Europeans recapitalize their banks so that the private sector banks in Europe have more cushion to absorb bad debt. The EFSF engages in a multiplier relationship with the ECB and enhances the amount of lending that it's able to do, its own resources, the so-called firewall. Yannis's proposal for the European Investment Bank sort of fueling investment-led growth is a terrific add-on to that idea. And then at the global level, I think there is work underway to increase the resources of the IMF by various means, another SDR allocation on the one hand. There's talk about the longer-term quota increase and a quota formula reform to go with it.
Colin, let me just jump in there because I've been hanging in there with most of your acronyms. Resources. Hang on a sec. I've been hanging in there with your acronyms, but the last one you hit me with I missed. SDR is what?
Sorry, the special drawing right. I knew I shouldn't have mentioned that. The special
bridge
drawing
too
right
far
of
you
the
went.
fund is a currency which like the euro can be enhanced, let's say, in terms of its supply. So the good point to catch me on that, but the most important point here is that also at the national, regional, and global levels is you could have commitments to increase financial resources around global plans for both growth and austerity. They're not necessarily trade-offs, because you can have investment-led growth, which creates employment at the same time that you're reducing the size of the public sector and its debt. So, and that's the trick. And it's to do all of this simultaneously, I think, is the big issue, is that too much now has sort of reverted back to single nation and single actor action rather than multilateral consensus agreements among the major countries to move forward simultaneously at all three levels. In which case, it takes us to a question of whether the euro is going to survive. And to that end, I want to read something that Manita Hu just said. He wrote this in CNBC's hedge fund specialist on CNBC.com. The Eurozone is doomed to fail because the divide between the northern and southern countries is just too great, former Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan told CNBC in a recent interview. Here's a quote. At the outset of the creation of the euro in 1999, it was expected that the southern Eurozone economies would behave like those in the north. The Italians would behave like Germans. Well, they didn't, Greenspan said. The effect of the divergent cultures in the Eurozone has been grossly underestimated, he added. The only way to have several currencies from divergent nations lumped together is if they are culturally close, such as Germany, the Netherlands, and Austria. If they aren't, it simply can't continue to work. That's Alan Greenspan. Yannis, what do you think?
I have disagreed all my life with Alan Greenspan. I do not propose to change now. The problem is not a cultural problem. There are these cultural differences. It would be nice not to have them. But on the other hand, Europe would be a poorer place if we didn't have these cultural differences. The problem is not even the common currency. The problem is that we have a common currency that does not have the institutional design in order to absorb shocks like big crisis international or to deal with the internal imbalances that Matthias was mentioning too. We can put these institutions in place. And if we allow the euro just to break up now, we're going to bring down the rest of the global economy with us. Let's not forget that this is a comment on what Colin was saying, and I agree with him. But I would put it slightly differently about the G20, the global economy in Europe, and so on. Europe is to the world that which Greece is to Europe. It is the one entity that is impeding a rational redesign of the global economy at the moment. So Europe has to pull itself together, just like Greece needs to, before it can take its place around the G20 table as part of a new approach to creating a new Bretton Woods, or however we want to put it, that will deal with the global imbalances. First, we need to deal with our internal European imbalances. We can do that. We don't need to have, this is where I disagree with Matthias, we don't need to have the German taxpayers paying for the bills of the Greeks or the Italians. We have the European Central Bank, which can either print money or, even better, so that sensibilities in Germany are not ruffled. It can actually borrow money by, this is why I keep returning to it, by issuing its own bonds and offering a conversion loan, no haircuts, no write-downs, to member states of the Eurozone, a rational debt management plan. The only reason why this is not happening is not because our leaders in Germany and the Netherlands are not smart enough in order to know that this is a solution. The reason why this is not happening is if this happens, then suddenly the Chancellor of Germany is going to lose her exit option. Now she can leave the euro because she's a surplus, she is leading a surplus country, and surplus countries can leave. That exit card is not one she wants to use, but it is one she wants to have in her handbag. Because by having it, Mr. Sarkozy will never speak his mind in front of the German Chancellor. These are the political constraints that are stopping Europe from dealing with its institutional design faults, and thus stopping Europe from doing what its duty ought to be within the G20, along the lines of what Colin was saying.
Matthias, you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, just to make this absolutely clear to Yanis's point, I wasn't suggesting as much the Germans paying the bills to the Greeks and the Italians, rather than if the Germans are telling them to stop spending, that the Germans could spend a little more. I mean, it'd be a nice idea if Germany would pledge for the next 10 years to spend all their holidays in Greece and Italy, because that would be a wonderful export for those countries and would definitely help and would be a sign of solidarity. But whether as to the euro can, I mean, I totally agree. Europe is to the world right now what Greece and Italy are to the eurozone, and I think in that sense, global leaders need to be very much aware of this and try to coordinate. And just to follow up on Colin's point, I mean, I very much agree. All these little things could help. I mean, $100 billion from China will not solve the eurozone crisis, but combined with Federal Reserve support and action on all levels on the Eurozone and globally, this would definitely, I mean, restore some kind of confidence in that the Eurozone will survive. And I think right now we're teetering at this point where people are actually actively doubting the collapse of the Eurozone.
Colin, is there a case to be made that if Greece were to leave the Eurozone, it would actually help solve the crisis in a positive way?
There's a case to be made for that, but it's the contagion problem once again. I mean, I think the reason why Nicolas Sarkozy and Angela Merkel were so serious this last weekend in Cannes about that Europe will hold itself together, Sarkozy said, is because they fear that if Greece were to pull out, which in itself, by itself, would not be a major thing for the Eurozone, is that Italy might follow suit and Spain might follow suit, and then you have a pulling apart of the whole system. I think the underlying thing that we have to keep in mind in all of this is the fact that to have a fixed exchange rate regime, which is what the Eurozone is, you have to have fiscal discipline within that regime. The real anchor for a fixed exchange rate regime is fiscal discipline. And clearly what's happened here is in Greece and Italy particularly, is that the fiscal policy has gotten way out of hand in relation. I mean, the Maastricht Treaty years ago set a 3% of GDP target, which has been exceeded by at least 3 percentage points of GDP in both the case of Italy and Greece. So, and other countries too now have breached that threshold. So, you know, that's the underlying problem. And
Colin, let me remind you that the first to have breached the 3% Maastricht were the Germans.
When did they do that?
Yeah, that could be, yes, that could be.
Right at the beginning.
They did, huh?
Yeah. Yeah, but that's the European political economy problem now, is that there's no fiscal discipline mechanism to accompany the fixed exchange rate regime. And that's what really makes the whole earthquake happen within the Eurozone.
Matthias, I see you trying to get in.
Yeah, I think my colleague at George Washington University, Henry Farrell, has suggested this in Foreign Affairs. We probably need to reform the Maastricht Treaty also thinking of some kind of harder Keynesianism, as in it's all fine to have deficits, but how about forcing countries to have surpluses, not very large, but at least some surpluses in times that the economy is doing very well. I mean, in the end, we're all Keynesians when things are going badly, but none of us are Keynesians when things are going well. And I think that's often forgotten. When there's growth, everybody wants part of the growth, and we still run deficits. And I think we would have been in a much better position if, and the same for the United States for that matter, from 2003 to 2007, if the governments had run small surpluses.
Now, I know none of you is, you know, has a, what do you call it? You're not fortune tellers with crystal balls and this kind of thing. Having said that, let's finish off on how are we doing on timing here? Got about 2 minutes to go. So, Yanis, let me get this to you. It wasn't that long ago that one of the top supermodels in the world, a woman named Gisele Bündchen, who's married to the quarterback of the New England Patriots, said that she wanted to be paid for one of her jobs not in American dollars but in euros. because it was the world's most trusted currency at that time. In the midst of all of this, can you envisage a time when the euro will once again reclaim that kind of position on the world stage?
Only if the European Union redesigns the institutional setting of the euro. But is it not interesting that the euro is not collapsing the way one would have expected, given all this discussion? Let me tell you why it's not. Because the value of the euro today reflects the expected value of the Deutschmark that will be reconstituted. So we have a catastrophic cascade within Europe. Let me just give you a little tidbit here. In the United States of America, if you have a dollar in a bank account in Las Vegas, or in Chicago, or in New York, they have exactly the same value.
Yes.
That is not the case in the Eurozone. A euro in a Greek bank account has a lower expected value than a euro in a Paris bank account. And a euro in a Paris bank account has a lower expected value, as we speak, compared to a euro in a bank account in Frankfurt. This is a sign of a currency union in an advanced stage of disintegration.
I want to thank all three of you for coming on tonight and helping us understand some very complicated times, but I think we understand it a lot better after the past hour. Colin Bradford with CG and the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., Matthias Matisse, the American University in Washington, D.C., and here in Toronto, Yanis Varoufakis from the University of Athens. His new book, The Global Minotaur, is some great reading for that which we are going through right now. My thanks to all three of you.
Thank you, Steve.